Hello and welcome to our last session of the day. I hope you've been enjoying the conference so far and found it stimulating, and you've been able to connect up with people as best as you can without actually physically being able to meet them. But we've got a really interesting final session for you and three fantastic panelists as ever. And this one is about trust and acceptability. What needs to happen to ensure that people trust the technology, they trust that it's safe, that the laws are in place to protect people, and that we make sure it's environmentally friendly as well. So I'll just take you through our panelists and tell you a little bit about them. So first of all, we've got Professor Gopal Ramcham, who's Director for the Centre of Machine Intelligence at Southampton University. They've done a lot of work down there on autonomous vehicles. I've taken part in some of their studies, actually, when they were looking at my reaction times when a computer handed the car back to me after I was autonomously driving in a simulator. Gopal, you're an expert in studying systems where humans and robots work together. So how they form a team to achieve a goal, like, for example, deal with a humanitarian crisis. And you've also written a paper on how you can use AI to improve your fantasy football skills. And I believe as well, you are helping Bayern Munich recruit, is that right?
We just got there, yes. But yeah, through my student working in a startup, yeah, we managed to take out the technology. That's good.
I'd love to find out more about.
Thank you, Richard.
Telling Bayern Munich goodbye. There's a few clubs could do with your services. And then we've got Lavinia Bursky, who's technology consultant at ACOM. She's a specialist in what she calls human-to-vehicle negotiations. So if we want to let a driver out of a junction, for example, how do we catch their eye and wave, when it's a computer and not a human being? What should a computer do? AECOM led a consortium you may have heard of 20 partners called Capri to design, develop and test autonomous pods on demand, including public trials at the Olympic Park in London. And your hobby is aerial arts, which is that like unbelievably dangerous thing when you hang upside down, is that right? And do acrobatics?
That is correct. Yes, that's like just my side hobby when I'm not working.
Yes,
on computers and robots.
just for a bit of stimulation. And then Alex Glassbrook, a barrister, Temple Garden Chambers. And Alex, I've got this quote about you. So you've written several books on the laws of autonomous vehicles, including a practical guide to the law of driverless cars. And here's the quote, and it says, "He's a very serene courtroom manner. He can be calm, but then quite deadly."
Yes, I'm never quite sure if that's a compliment or not, but it's.
I think in a courtroom, a big compliment, yeah. Party, less so. Right, so these guys are all just going to give us a little presentation first of all, 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so, and then as ever, we're going to go to the questions. We've had some brilliant questions in today. Again, if you like a question, click like on it and it shoots to the top of the leaderboard. But first of all, over to you, Gopal.
Thanks, Richard. And hi, everyone, and thanks to the Catapult for inviting me to give this talk, and looking forward to the discussion that will follow on. So as Richard said, I'm a professor of AI at Southampton. I'm also the director of a newly created Center for Trustworthy Autonomous Systems. It's called the UKRI Task Hub, and it helps coordinate a large research effort across the UK. I'm going to talk about that in a bit. But generally speaking, my interests are in trustworthy and trusted autonomous technology, generally speaking, in terms of not just the robots and the vehicles, but also in software that make decisions on our behalf. And there are huge issues of trust that arise. And just today, we launched our podcast on the Task Hub to talk about the Test and Trace app, for example, that embeds some notion of autonomy. And there are many other similar applications on the web, on our apps, on our phones that embed this autonomy that we need to trust and design to be trustworthy so that they can be effective in helping us in our daily lives. So just to go a bit deeper, next slide, please. In terms of the work I'm currently leading with the Task Hub, it's a £33 million program over the next 4 years, looking at developing the world leading best practices for the design, regulation, and operation of socially beneficial autonomous systems. It's really about building systems that are trustworthy in principle and trustworthy by design and in practice, are trusted by both individuals and society, and also as part of that, government and industry. So really, it's a large program that will look at fundamental research, taking many different perspectives from the social sciences, psychology, engineering, AI, etc., and bringing all of these the best minds in the country and bringing the whole community really around this critical problem in terms of trusting these autonomous technologies of various kinds that are gradually being embedded in our society. There are huge legal issues. We're going to hear about that later. There are huge interactional issues. And what I'd like to do in this short talk is just give you an idea of what sorts of questions that we're trying to address, at least at Southampton, but also of relevance to a number of other research groups distributed across the UK. Next slide, please. So this picture sort of serves to illustrate the point that when we look at trust in autonomous technologies, and here in autonomous vehicles, we typically focus on reliability, on trustworthiness, on their resilience, and when failures happen, they can quickly recover, the accident rates, etc., etc. But the key question is, really, do we trust these systems? For example, and if you click, please, Leanne, the question that arises here is, will you trust this autonomous car to take your children to school? So as soon as you put this question in this way, rather than generally speaking, do you trust autonomous vehicles? The context of the application, the context of the deployment of the technology raises new questions around liability, around public acceptance, public perception, the occupant's interaction with the vehicle, for example, here, the relationship of the parent with the vehicle or whoever is looking after people who are in that vehicle, and the relationship between the company and the user or the passengers. And all these questions need to be addressed if we're going to deploy these vehicles on our roads. So it's not just sufficient to look at purely the technology, and this is why many autonomous technologies are not currently adopted or are struggling to be adopted in the UK and across the world. And I'm going to come back to the public perception issue later down the line. And these similar questions sort of arise in a number of other sectors. For example, in robotic surgery or the Test and Trace app. So, for example, with Test and Trace and the A-level issues we had earlier this year, who's responsible in those cases? Who's responsible for the autonomous decision making? It's really difficult to unpack that for the general public, for industry, and I think there's a lot of work to be done there, and the Task Hub will help address some of these questions at least. Next slide, please. So here I'm going to try and unpack a bit some of the key constructs I think we need to be concerned about or investigate if we're going to try and build trustworthy and trusted autonomous vehicles or any kind of autonomous technology. If you can click, sorry, I meant to do this myself, but I think we need to worry about regulation and certification of these technologies. So there's a huge sort of institutional regulatory type piece of work. Next, please. There's obviously the engineering element. So building these machines to be reliable, to be verifiably reliable. So making sure that we can deploy them safely for everyone, for users of different types in different sorts of environments, making sure they can quickly recover in cases where they find themselves in environments they've never seen before. For example, when there's bad weather, when there's an accident on the road, when the roadsides change, can we still drive these things safely? And the third bit, which I think is the most relevant one for me, and I think where the really chunky research questions lie, are in terms of the human-machine partnerships. So who's in control, for example, and I'm going to unpack these questions in a bit, but what sorts of partnership do we form with these machines? How do we engage with them? How do we communicate with them? And how do we trust them as a result of these interactions? So next, please. So really summarizing the points here, I think trust is built on these different constructs. So these institutional constructs, these human-machine partnerships, and reliability and resilient technology. So really building the hardcore engineering of these systems. And I'm going to focus mainly on how these partnerships should be designed and how they should evolve over time, because this is, I think, the key bit that really needs multiple disciplines to come together and try and address these questions that are at the socio-technical end. So not purely technical, not purely socio-psychological, but really a mix of everything, and needs a sort of a jointly designed research, jointly defined experiments and engineering, and also informs the way we're going to regulate those systems, informs the way we're going to certify those systems. Because as soon as you build systems that involve humans and machines, it's very hard to predict how humans will behave in certain circumstances. You can't verify every human is different. So how do you make sure that the users understand the implications of using the technology, for example? How do you make sure they understand the liability issues, and how do you make sure the machines understand in what sort of situations they're putting their human counterparts in? And these partnerships can take different forms. It may be one where you have a driver and a car. It may be one where you just have the passengers and the vehicle, or it may be a swarm of drones that are flying, but only with one operator. And all these different sorts of situations and contexts require different interaction mechanisms. They require different ways of organizing those systems of humans and also systems of machines, so organizations of humans and machines. So next slide, please. So I'll give you two examples here where the human-machine partnership breaks down. The top one is the Uber driver, as you may have seen these pictures before in the news. This comes from CNN. So Uber driver was watching a video when the accident happened on these US roads. In the picture at the bottom, you have a Tesla driver who was eating and drinking. And here they clearly had a huge amount of trust in the autopilot feature of the Tesla, a huge amount of trust in the autonomous function of the Uber system. And that trust has been probably built over multiple interactions, or built based on how Tesla marketed the product to them, the words used, etc. But and that clearly raises questions as to who is in charge, how should we put someone in charge, whether it's the machine or the human, and when should we really shift control back to the human or give control to the machine? When should we allow this to happen? In this context where a human driver may be in the vehicle, a human non-driver, could be a passenger, may be in the vehicle for long periods of time, and may get tired, may get distracted, may not be interested in driving, or may be paying attention to the alerts on the screen. And then how does the machine then make sure that the human is paying attention? Can it actually make sure that the human is paying attention to its alerts and knows what to do when things go wrong? So huge questions about these issues, and we're going to come back to how we justify the use of autonomous vehicles on our roads, and how companies go about dealing with such events like these accidents, because these are one or two accidents that really grab the media attention and everyone talks about them, but really we're not getting across the critical issues. In different articles, you'll see different things being blamed, whether it's the manufacturer or the driver, or the autonomous technology, but there's no clear answer to these for the public right now. So next slide, please. So here I try to explain a bit further what I mean by the sort of requirements for human-machine partnerships, and particularly for the need for flexible autonomy. And by that I mean designing the autonomy and the controls over these autonomous machines of various kinds, such that it can be flexed at different points in time, and answering those questions that arise in terms of when should machines ask for permission, when should machines just inform their human counterparts of what they are up to, how should they communicate their intent or what they are about to do next, and how the humans in turn monitor the quality of machine decision making and vice versa, and when to take control. So these are all these sorts of issues that are to do with human machine interaction. And there are many more issues. I'm going to go through all of them, but in terms of shifting that control between human and machine, these are typically the kind of questions you'd like to answer. But there are other bigger issues emerging as we see more and more machines and more humans interacting with these autonomous machines. If we're going to have one drone being monitored, controlled by a team of humans, how should we form those teams of humans? How should we organize the roles within those teams? If we're going to have autonomous machines in production plants, how should we assign the roles such that we can both monitor what the machines are up to and also undertake the job that we are supposed to do on these production lines? And then how should these relationships change? How should the roles change? And how should we manage multiple users talking to one or more machines at a time? Because these machines obviously cannot perceive in the way we can perceive things around us. So how should we design these relationships and then understand how humans perceive those relationships? So these are difficult challenges that we address under the theme of interactional arrangements. So I'm going to close on one last slide, which is to do with public perception. So you may have seen these news reports that tend to be attention grabbing, right? Self-driving cars could be allowed on UK motorways next year, or more attention grabbing stories around killer robots, right? That talk about the autonomous machines taking over. And it's important for us to demystify this and to make sure that the general public understands what these technologies are actually capable of, and how they will affect our well-being, whether it's our physical or mental well-being, how they will improve the economy, etc., and make that very clear. Unfortunately, the poor use of words or the poor use of media grabbing headlines does hurt the research that we undertake, does hurt perception of the research. So next, please. You'll see, for example, in the case of the self-driving cars title that you see here, this was about automatic lane detection system. So these systems that would detect whether you're driving along the road within the white lines, and would force you to stay within those lines, or nudge you to stay within those lines on the motorway. So these are guidance systems. These are sort of automated in some ways, but not fully autonomous. But the word used here was self-driving, and clearly it is not self-driving in all ways. It is self-driving in some ways. So it's a really poor use of the word self-driving here, and many researchers were up in arms about this. Next, please. So terminology is leading to the confusion. For example, the use of different words to describe the same thing or different things, whether it's autonomous, automated, self-driving, driverless. And I think we need to work on setting the guidelines as to what terminology should be used in what circumstances, and also depending on how we explain the different levels of autonomy to a lay audience. And there's not much research in going into that right now in terms of explaining this to a general audience and marketing those products, helping industry market those products in the right way. And finally, last point, I think we struggle these days to do this because it's not all the media's fault, but we struggle because the audience is in need of short, 140 character type messages that they can grasp very quickly. And therefore, it's becoming increasingly difficult to shape public perception of these autonomous vehicles. And we need to work harder on setting the guidelines and how we promote these justifications to use autonomous vehicles and all sorts of autonomous technologies. For example, one last thing, I think I'm running out of time. Tesla, for example, 2 years ago mentioned that it had reduced accidents by 40% by simply turning on its autopilot feature. But if you go and verify what data it was used, you can not actually prove that it was the autopilot feature that resulted in this reduction in accidents. And you can just Google it online. There's a nice article on Wired about this. So who is checking on that data set? Who is checking the veracity of the claims made about the safety of autopilot technology or autonomous technologies in general? And I think we need a much more open approach to make it accessible and make it verifiable and trustworthy for the general public to accept these technologies. So on that note, I'll close, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Gopal. Obviously, I take no responsibility for the media hyping anything. It wasn't me, Garth. I'm sure we'll talk about that later. It's a really interesting point, the messaging, definitely. Very interesting point. But first of all, let's hear from Lavinia.
Sorry, I'm just getting up my slides. So today I'll be talking about autonomous vehicle negotiations using agreement patterns, which I think is an important topic to address, but it's often overlooked. I think it's a good place to mention here about the Capri project, which AECOM led 18 partners through 3 automated pod trials. Results? Oh, sorry. Are they there now? So, where was I? AECOM led 18 partners through automated vehicle pod trials. There was supposed to be 4 trials, but unfortunately the 4th trial was cancelled due to COVID reasons. However, 3 trials were a success. Most people are happy to use a pod at an airport, university, or hospital, and they're happy to share, but expect services to be free. People want to know that these pods are safe. People weren't so keen on sharing pedestrian space with pods, especially at higher speeds, and would prefer not to mix with traffic on the road. However, we know in environments such as airports, universities, and hospitals, there are many pedestrians coming and going. Therefore, it's important to find a way for these pods to communicate with pedestrians and to let them know of their intentions. My favorite picture on this slide is the little boy waving at the pod. However, he could be waving at the pod to try and grab the pod's attention for some reason. His intention is unknown. Once we enter the road network, we need to start a constant information exchange or a negotiation with our fellow road users. A wave of a hand or direct eye contact with a driver can offer a sense of road safety that technology at the moment simply can't. MIT research has even found that drivers are stopping earlier and further away for pedestrians than a stop sign. There seems to be a pattern in behavior between pedestrians and driver interaction. In 2016, Professor Natasha Merritt from the University of Leeds surveyed 644 cyclists and pedestrians in order to identify what concerned them most about interacting with driverless cars. The biggest request was for a clear, unambiguous way to signal to the road user that they have been seen by the car's sensors, a gesture that gives them the confidence to know what the autonomous car is about to do. So what form could this interaction take? One way of representing these negotiations is by using agreement patterns. Agreement patterns were first defined in a 2009 paper. The example then was given for a service provider. Agreement patterns define a pattern for sharing and reusing experiences which form a certain agreement. They show an abstract way of thinking about agreements, such as negotiations between two or more parties. There are three parts to an agreement pattern: an informal representation, a reasoning diagram, and formal representations. And I'll give examples of each of these later in the slide. Agreement patterns have been used to model UAV to humans. So why not represent them between a cab and humans? All informal representations of agreement patterns have these set categories. Our example given on this slide shows an autonomous vehicle about to enter a city and is about to start a negotiation with the city's authority. Name gives the meaning to the pattern. The duration gives an idea of how long the negotiation takes place. For example, a negotiation for buying a house could take months, whereas negotiation to buy something in a shop is relatively quick. Context describes the preconditions under which the agreement will take place. Forces describe the influences and constraints and how they interact with each other and the goals of the agreement. Solutions describe the rules, and relationships describing how to realize the desired outcome. So this discusses what exactly takes place during the negotiation. Examples give one or more sample applications of the pattern which illustrates its application. The resulting context describes the state or states of the system after the pattern has been applied, and relating patterns identify which similar patterns this agreement pattern relates to. The second part to a pattern agreement is to represent it in diagrammatic format. Rectangle boxes represent the knowledge role, that is, the functional role of data on which the inference operates and describes. The round boxes is an inference role, which describes functional roles such as abstract names of data. We used the solution to draw the diagram, where solution was written in the informal part of the agreement pattern. So using our example, we say the vehicle wants to enter the city, and that's why the negotiation initiates. It asks for access, giving various details, such as the type of vehicle it is. The authority then assesses and decide based on whether the vehicle is stolen or perhaps whether it's a freight vehicle. And then it decides and approves entry into the city. There may be conditions such as the vehicle has to download the latest maps containing all the restrictions before it enters the city. The third and final component to an agreement pattern is to list the preconditions and postconditions of the agreement in a formal manner. So in our example, we have the following preconditions. The vehicle speed is 70 miles per hour. The vehicle is in a motorway driving mode. The vehicle is not currently in the city and it currently does not have permission to enter. I should also add another precondition that the vehicle wants to or has the intention to enter the city. Then we state the desired outcome in the post conditions. So then the car decreases its speed to 20 miles per hour. The reason we want to represent our negotiations in such a formal manner is to describe the functionality of the negotiation to the software developers in an explicit manner so they can translate it into code correctly. So what are the benefits of agreement patterns for negotiations with autonomous cars? We can identify commonalities for negotiations between various vehicle manufacturers and technologies. With a formal definition of the agreements, we can reduce ambiguity and add refinement for the system, which can be passed along to relevant stakeholders such as developers, designers, and customers, so on. Agreement patterns are not designed to be a replacement of testing autonomous vehicles, but as an addition to the design stage to add refinement and therefore safety. You reduce system errors and ambiguity in the design stage, then this will follow through with the rest of the system lifecycle. Safety of autonomous systems is a big thing. Without convincing stakeholders and the general public that these systems are safe, then no one is going to want to use them. There is a variety of paths we can take with agreement patterns. First, there's the more theoretical work to be done to research what negotiations take place between pedestrians and drivers currently, model them in agreement pattern format, and identify how to translate this for autonomous vehicles. Then there is the option to use the research and emulate them in a simulated environment in order to evaluate trust and confidence in the autonomous vehicle. Another path we can take is to do a full-on trial of pedestrians and autonomous vehicles to mimic the negotiations which take place in the real world. This work has described how agreement patterns can be used to describe human and autonomous vehicle negotiations. However, there's the potential to investigate what other autonomous devices can be modeled using agreement patterns and whether they can help us with future autonomous vehicle negotiations. That was my talk. So thank you all for listening. I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end.
Thanks, Lavinia. Some really interesting points raised there, things that we've actually heard through the day as well. It sounds like that would need quite a lot of collaboration to come up with a kind of uniform set of rules. And we need to get the software right as well. And we heard in the last session how that software interacting between humans and computers has stalled a little bit and isn't quite as far advanced as a lot of people would hope. So now we're going to get into the law. It's obviously an absolutely critical part of getting this right and of getting trust. People have to know that if there's going to be an accident, they're going to be protected in the law. And this is where you come in, Alex.
Yes, thanks, Richard. So just to give this a bit of context, as Richard said, I'm a practicing barrister. I'm also a writer about automated vehicle law. I've written 2 books. I'm currently writing my 3rd, which is going to be published by Bloomsbury in 2022. So that's book plug over. The common thread between this talk and Gopal and Lavinia's talks is actually human factors, because the law, although there's a great deal of law about vehicle specifications, for example, the whole thrust of the law is about human factors. So first of all, I wanted to find a way to try and sort of express the structure of the law in this country. We have a common law system, and what that means is that rules are set primarily by Parliament, by passing statute law, and those statutes are then interpreted by judges in a succession of cases. And one way of looking at this is regarding it as a large building of many rooms, each of the rooms considering particular facts and particular details of cases. And conveniently, there is a legal building fitting that description, which is the Royal Courts of Justice. And that's a picture there of the RCJ as we know it on the Strand just after it was built in the 1860s. Now, the 1860s are a convenient period, in fact, when considering road transport, because it's the period just before the motor car. Benz invents the first essential working motor car in 1885, and it comes into mass civilian use just before the 1920s. And one way of gauging this, for example, is the Ministry of Transport, the Department of Transport as now is founded in 1919. So there's your image of the RCJ. Keep that in mind. And just note for a moment the traffic that's outside it. It's pedestrian and horse-driven, no motor cars yet. So since the 1920s, we've had a century of driving. And what has happened factually during that period? Well, we've had motor vehicles, for the most part, the internal combustion engine driven by petrol or diesel fuels, and more recently, electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles. Just a footnote, although in fact in the UK, electric vehicles have not previously been a big phenomenon. In fact, certainly in the US, they date back to the 19th century, but the internal combustion engine prevailed because in Texas, they struck oil in 1901, and so petrol-driven traffic became the dominant tech. We've also had a mix of traffic over the century, cyclists, horse riders, motor vehicles, pedestrians. And latterly, we've had mobile communications technology, which of course is a relatively recent innovation, but one of huge effect and huge impact upon road transport. And with those changes came a century of legal change. In the first place, negligence became the basis of behaviour that the law could remedy in drivers. And although negligence is a term of civil law, the same standard in effect applies to criminal law. And people tend to understand through familiarity of this century of law that carefulness and reasonable care for other drivers and road users is the legal standard. With that, in this country, we didn't adopt a no-fault system because we were adjudicating it according to driver care, but we introduced a compulsory third-party motor insurance system whereby any driver found to be negligent who had injured somebody would be backed up by indemnity insurance. And that was made compulsory at law in 1930. Now, that really goes hand in hand with negligence plus insurance. And again, that tends to be a common understanding. Just before we leave this point, this is a point I'm going to develop. The way that drivers have been kept aware of their duties as drivers in precise detail has been twofold. It's been by a driving test, which at the moment is mandatory driving test at the outset of your driving career. And secondly, by the Highway Code, which is guidance produced by the Department of Transport and amended from time to time. And so one has a system of mandatory test at the outset and then further information. I'll return to that. One other feature of law over the last century is the law of contribution, the idea that more than one person can contribute to an accident. That was spurred by cars. It was reformed in the 1930s and 1940s. Before that, only one person could be held liable, and it was defense for anybody else to point to them. And then finally, and much more recently, with mobile communications, we have the laws of privacy and data protection. So that's the last century. What about the new surroundings? Well, this is the same building. This is the Royal Courts of Justice. This is a pre-pandemic photograph. The Strand is much less busy at the moment, but you can see motor traffic there, 2 buses. And I think it's not an electric, but a petrol or diesel driven cab, but it's advertising a hailing app. And so there you've got illustrated the changes that surround the centuries old common law. What's the current change? Well, we've got more electric vehicles and more digital controls. As well as being a road user as a pedestrian and a cyclist, I'm a recently converted EV driver. So my current car is a level 2 vehicle that's level 3 capable. And pretty soon, as I drive and other drivers of those vehicles drive, we're going to assume the legal responsibilities of those new vehicles. Secondly, we've got faster vehicles. Electric vehicles have better traction and are quicker, certainly much quicker to accelerate. And that includes smaller vehicles, micro-mobility vehicles such as e-scooters. Incidentally, the scooter is nothing new. There was a petrol version which excited much of the same objections in 1915 called the Autoped. Thirdly, more communications technology. We're on 5G at the moment. 5G is on nationwide expansion as we speak, and 6G, the 6th generation of mobile communications, will be with us shortly. And then, coming over the horizon, automated driving, aka driverless, as Gopal has said. So what's the law? Well, coming back to our negligence plus insurance structure, the insurance part of this is dealt by the Automated and Electric Vehicles Act 2018. This is a statute that's on the statute book since July of 2018, but it's not yet in force. And the reason it's not yet in force is it's awaiting the vehicles. When those vehicles come in, this act will place a strong direct liability on the insurer of an automated vehicle in relation to any damage or injury caused by that vehicle when it is driving itself. The Act does something else that's quite new. The current Road Traffic Act, the 1988 Act, sets a number of exceptions to compulsory insurance in relation to modifications of the vehicle. One absolutely central exception, in fact, the only operative exception in the Act, apart from modifying software, is that the driver has to keep safety critical software updated on the vehicle. And that is over the air. And I can tell you, as the owner of a level 2 EV, software updates are frequent. And I've yet to see a software update which doesn't have some safety critical feature. So making sure that your software is updated on your car is critical to keeping your insurance in effect. I say that it's awaiting the vehicles. There is a current ambiguity in the 2018 Act as to which vehicles it will apply to. And this is the debate around automated lane keeping. Because when the Act was in bill form, it was revised in its draft version to define automated vehicles as vehicles driving themselves which did not need to be monitored. And the reason for that was ostensibly to distinguish between level 4 and 5 vehicles, which would fall under the Act, and level 3 vehicles, which would not. This point is currently being revisited by the Department of Transport's current consultation, which just closed. And it's being revisited because of the automated lane keeping system, ALKS, also known as traffic jam chauffeur, because that is a system that combines both the automated driving features of an automated system and yet still needs to be monitored. And so the current question, which is a question for the government of the Secretary of State for Transport, is whether the Act needs to be either amended or supplemented as to apply to ALKS. So that's insurance. What of the Highway Code? Well, the Highway Code first appeared in 1931. It was amended in November of 2018, just after the 2018 Act hit the statute book, to include some guidance for ADAS, advanced driver assistance systems, and remote parking and the like. And it was amended in a way that, in fact, just reiterated an idea that's over 100 years old, since the first of the 19th century acts that dealt with driving. Just to reiterate driver control. Rule 160 also says that the driver must understand the manufacturer's instructions. Well, I can tell you, as I suspect many of you know from looking at these manuals, that these manuals vary greatly in terms of length and detail. I've seen one approaching 700 pages. So where does the driver go to learn new skills? What of the new driving test? Well, this is a point that's in limbo at the moment. The Law Commission consulted about this in November 2018 and found that while 69% of respondents were in favour of new driver training, when asked about the detail, nobody could agree on whom was to provide it. There's been a very authoritative recent report from the RAC Foundation and the University of Nottingham called Driver Training for Future Automated Vehicles. I'll post the link on the chat room, which makes the powerful point, in my view, that some further need for training beyond our traditional driving test at the outset of driving career is needed. Why is all of this important? Well, it's important for an educational reason. Drivers need to know what the new routines of driving are. Not all of these controls are intuitive. This word intuitive is used a lot, including in draft regulations. These are new skills, as the RAC Foundation report makes important. The public need to know these things and need to know confidently that they know these things for trust to be established. And among the public, though they might look strange, and I speak with some caution because my wife is a judge, so I'm going to be careful here. Judges who hear these cases are very often drivers themselves, and they base their judgments, at least in part, on their own experience of vehicles. They need to know about these vehicles as well. They're not as fusty as as they might seem. This is a satirical drawing by Hogarth in the 18th century, but if you look very carefully, you can see that the Chief Justice is using an iPad. Thank you very much indeed.
Wow, you're married to a judge. I'd love to hear your family arguments. Who wins those, a barrister versus a judge?
I never win those.
We're getting some good questions in, so I'll come to these in a second. Just quickly, Alex, while we've just spoken quickly about training, do you mean mass training of everybody that gets an autonomous vehicle, or do you mean mass training of everybody that drives so that they know how to deal with an autonomous vehicle, or do you just mean new drivers?
Well, the answer is that we're in a transitional stage and there's a whole variety of vehicles on the roads, and that will equally be true when these new vehicles come in. That's a point that, in fact, the RAC Foundation University of Nottingham point report deals with. I can say from and the conclusion it reaches is that there is going to have to be particular training for particular systems, not least because it makes the point that level 3 and upwards is actually broadly a different type of task with automated driving. It's supervision and intervention rather than active driving. So I think we're about to go into a period where there are many varieties of vehicle. I mean, it's what I referred to when I wrote my first book about this, is the messy transition period.
And Lavinia, does this sort of feed into your work at all? The fact that, you know, if we're going to have this interaction with computers, do you think that people will have to be trained to understand what a computer means and thinks and how it's going to react? Or do you see it so that we have to design the computers to completely work around humans?
Oh, for sure. Like, because you have lots of different types of people in the world. I mean, you've got young, old, technically minded people, people who don't know how to use a computer. So all these autonomous vehicles, once you start the negotiations and the communication between a vehicle and a human being needs to be simple enough so that human being can understand it, whether even if they're not technically competent or mildly technically competent, we'll say. So it needs to be obvious what the vehicle is trying to communicate, and back so the vehicle needs to understand what the human is trying to say to it.
Gopal, does this feed into your work as well? Can you see it forming a sort of bedrock for training? For once we have an understanding of that interaction, and that will be used to improve our training. Did you lose me?
I'm back on. Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, my hope is that we won't need to train any drivers one day, right? We will be able to put people in autonomous vehicles and let elderly people from care homes get into a car, go to the hospital and get their vaccine. That would be ideal from next week. That's the ideal case. I can't see anyone in the future trusting an autonomous vehicle if they have to read manuals and have to keep updating their vehicles every month and check updates and wait for this download while they're on the motorway or something. There are some obvious things that people won't trust, I think, and getting over these and getting the message across, to the the engineering side, and then building. I think thinking about the transition. How do we educate the driver population, the user population? It's not just the drivers, the occupants of those vehicles. Educate them along that path to the point where we can put them in vehicles and let them go off without any drivers. And I think staging that and government and the media have to play an important role in doing this.
Gopal, we'll stick with you. We'll go to some questions coming in. So, I mean, it says to all the panelists, but basically, how safe is safe enough for wide adoption by the public? What do you think the route is to get us there? Gopal, we'll go back to you.
Right. So what's safe? So the public and it depends on the users again. I think Lavinia mentioned, you have old, young, early adopters. Obviously, those who suffered those accidents in the US with the Tesla and the Uber car, they were early adopters or they were test engineers, etc. So they are very keen to trust those systems, but the trust relationship with the vehicle doesn't just exist between the driver and the vehicle. It also exists between the driver or the owner of the vehicle or the company or the insurer and the user of those vehicles. So we need to think about how these different users and regulators and insurers of these various systems have these relationships, and the combination of these relationships will determine whether these systems get adopted by the general population and the general public. But up till then, it will still be the early adopters who still have an interest in getting the higher autonomy levels built into the vehicles, I think.
Lavinia, do you think there's a sort of tipping point where everybody's just so used to it they don't think about it anymore? Particularly as new generations come up, I suppose, and they just get used to, like young kids now don't seem to have the same sense of privacy that slightly older people would have, for example. They're just used to being on show all the time on camera.
I think there's a potential for that to happen, yes. If the young children grow up and that's all they've ever seen are autonomous vehicles on the road, it just becomes second nature to them. So same with iPads. So for example, my son is 1 year old and he already knows that how to use an iPad and touch screens, and it just becomes second nature to him. So I think with autonomous vehicles, it could happen. But you've also, like Gopal said, you've got the technology enthusiasts who are a little bit older, but just keeping on top of things. So they're there and they'll be the ones saying to the younger generation, oh, back in my day, we didn't have autonomous vehicles and the roads were completely different. But you'll also have those people who will never adopt an autonomous vehicle. For example, the guy or girl who buys a Ferrari doesn't buy a Ferrari just for mobility, just to get from A to B. They bought a Ferrari because they like the driving experience. And I think you'll have those people who just won't adopt an autonomous vehicle because it's not for them.
Lavinia, I'm intrigued actually, and you might not have an exact answer to this, but is the key difference between adopting technology, do you think, generational, or is there a geographical element to it, or is it people from different communities? Is there a gender element to it, or do we just not have those kind of answers yet? Who adopts it the quickest and who's the most resistant?
To be honest, I can't give you a straight answer. Like you said, that's quite difficult. perhaps if someone did a survey, maybe they would find younger generations are quickest to adopt, but that's not necessarily true. It's not everyone. I think it's a big mix, really.
Okay, I'm going to get this question to you, Alex, because I really like this. When will the first law be passed barring humans from driving?
A very long time away, if ever, actually. I mean, I speak, my granddad was a professional driver. He worked in the motor factories in the Midlands. And then when I was little, his retirement job was delivering high spec cars. So occasionally he'd turn up in our cul-de-sac in a Ferrari. I don't think outlawing human driving is in prospect at all. Another way of looking at this, I just don't think the utopian kind of shiny universe version works. One way of testing that is if you look back into, trackable history and compare it with now, there will always be a road where somebody is riding a horse, and that includes the middle of the city or the countryside. You could come across a mounted policeman in the middle of the city, or a rider elsewhere, or vice versa. There's a joy to driving that I don't think any government would have the slightest hope of trying to outlaw, even if they wanted to. Just coming back though on the automated driving question, I think because the pace of technological change has been so rapid over about the last 15 years, since 2005, we've had the iPhone, we've had Wi-Fi, we've had, self-driving cars going from being pure fantasy to becoming real. But the reality is that things like cruise control go back 70 years. I mean, that was invented in 1950 as a hydraulic system. And it was invented by an engineer called Ralph Teeter, who was blind. And his purpose in doing it was to try and develop a technology where blind people could operate cars. Well, look, it's taken 50 years to become electronic, and we may be on the cusp of that. So I think there are a lot of changes in cars, but the fact is, the cars that I learned how to drive, you had to know how to use a clutch, which I imagine is a phrase that's completely bewildering to many people younger than me. And I suspect cars in the near future probably won't be manual transmission at all. That'll be a big change, but it won't change the fact that there are cars and that people enjoy driving them. They're just more assisted in how they drive them. I
guess this is a sort of, I suppose semi-joke question about timelines, but just quickly, what is the timeline to this? Because you described that building with lots of little rooms. It takes a long time to build a building. Are we going to be quite a way into the future before we've really got the laws that people can trust, because they rely on precedent, so things have to happen first?
Yeah, it's pure guesswork about the technology, because even when I started writing about this, which was only 4 years ago, the timeline for when the tech would arrive has changed quite dramatically even in that time. But you can give a rough comparator. So let's say the early Fords were manufactured and introduced to the UK in the early 1900s. I think, I might be wrong about this, but I think the Model N is about 1908, and I think the Model T is not much after that. By 1919, and bearing in mind that the First World War had intervened, British judges had decided that the law of negligence was the applicable law rather than the law of nuisance. And the Ministry of Transport had been founded. So within 10 years, and that decade includes the First World War, you have the laws. And actually one thing that the UK has done remarkably well at is preparing itself for automated vehicles. The Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles at the Department of Transport was founded in 2015. The Law Commission has been involved since very shortly after that. We have a statute on the statute book. That's more than the United States has. So we're in a good, strong position. And I think the laws and the courts would react on past experience quite quickly.
Gopal, I couldn't help but notice you mentioned the wonderful media. And I know everyone's always so happy with us, but there's a question here which I think sort of plays into that a little bit, and it just sort of says, with a soundbite answer, which is very television, how would you respond to someone who feels wary about AVs? And I guess we broaden that out. Are you worried about the media message at the moment? And what do you think the message should be from the industry to reassure people?
That's a good question. I can't do the media's job, obviously. I mean, deciding on the words to use here, but it is difficult to communicate this to a wide audience in a simple way. I completely understand the difficulty. I think substantiating any kind of recommendation to adopt autonomous vehicles requires good data and good experiments and good validation. But the challenge it will be more about the qualitative aspects rather than the quantitative aspects. So going, for example, with accident rates and telling people, look, our autonomous vehicles have reduced accidents. That convinces no one when most of the accidents are, take precedence on any news feed, right? So we need to think about what metrics we focus on when we talk to the general audience. So it's not maybe about accidents, it's about the value it brings to certain communities. So demonstrating more the value, say, to the elderly communities, the marginalized, in emergency response scenarios, where they find really good applications, and people will gradually, I think, understand where the benefits are more than where the risks are. We tend to focus too much on the risks. I think the industry should go out and talk about the benefits, not just to the early adopters, but the benefits to anyone in society, and particularly for those that are a bit marginalized by society, those who are less in touch with the technology and are most likely to benefit from the use of the technology.
Someone has written here, as part of harnessing media, do we need an autonomous automated vehicle version of Top Gear, not with Jeremy Clarkson, presumably? We can have an AI Jeremy Clarkson. That would be quite interesting, wouldn't it?
I'm sure that already happens. But
just one final question to Lavinia. You talked about this sort of formal definition that we need going forwards. Presumably that's going to rely on quite a lot of collaboration. And who comes up with that formal definition ultimately? Is that a law? Does the government have to come up with it, and then the motor manufacturers follow it? How does it work?
I think the formal definitions would involve a lot of stakeholders. You would have system designers writing the requirements for the autonomous vehicles, and then you have experts to translate these requirements into formal definitions. That they do exist, but there's not many of us in the world. And that would come in a negotiation. So perhaps the requirements would be translated formally, but there might need to be some more detail in some of the requirements and some of the system design. So it would go back to the stakeholders and then go back to the customers and the vehicle manufacturers. But the requirements will come from a lot of different elements. So you would have the law involved, you have policy stakeholders, you have the Highways England, road authorities, human factor experts. So a lot of people would need to design the requirements. And then the software developers would be involved to translate those requirements into the software code that actually goes into the vehicles and all their systems.
Well, guys, thank you very much. Yet another really stimulating discussion, and people not afraid to put their opinions out there. Thanks everyone actually who's contributed through the day. I think we've had a really fantastic sense of what is going well at the moment, but also what isn't going particularly well and what needs to happen, what the industry needs to do to kind of get this autonomy out there and to persuade the public that they can trust it and use it, and it's going to benefit the economy and improve safety and emissions and all the rest of it. So thank you very much to the team that's put together today. I think you'll agree, we'd all like to be in a room talking to each other and meeting. So we can't do that at the moment, but I think this has been a really well-run, well-organised conference. So well done to Stephen and Gail and the team for putting it together so well. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we come back at 4 o'clock to see who's won the prizes. So we have optional breakouts now. So you can choose between 5 sessions and discuss the topics with industry peers. So we've got a CAV decarbonisation session, automation and connected infrastructure, what's next for autonomous technology, trust and acceptability, and general networking. So all the things that we've talked about today. Come back at 4 o'clock and click on wrap up to find out who won the Catapult platform competition.